In our pursuit of the perfect look, we usually focus on finding the camera with the best image quality, highest resolution and dynamic range. But are these features all you should care about when looking for the right camera? Having worked in many professional sets, I found that even pro-level productions often choose cameras that score lower in image quality, yet scoring very high in other areas that are more critical to their shoots, such as size, battery life, setup time, remote operation and so on. Which explains why I often choose this tiny GH5 over the much beefier red camera in many of my smaller production shoots. Those reasons are behind all the small and often overlooked secondary camera features that are designed to make the camera work for you on set, not against you. These are features that pro DPs would look for in their camera of choice, especially with that nowadays it seems that all cameras has gotten really high in quality, that it's not a battle of resolution or dynamic range anymore, but rather a battle of features. Fortunately for us, the Panasonic S1H has a plethora of those awesome secondary features that together can become primary reason for you choosing this camera over obvious others. In this episode, I'll share with you 10 small features that you will love about the Panasonic S1H. I'll show you how those features will make a huge difference on set and how they made this camera stand out from all other popular cameras out there, ultimately letting the S1H help you focus on what matters the most, which is your creative process on set. If you like the music in this intro and in this episode, then I invite you to check Epidemic Sound. They're offering an awesome collection of royalty-free music and sound effects to score your projects. I personally use the commercial plan, which will not only let you use their tracks on personal projects, but also on unlimited commercial work that's cleared on all online platforms. Perfect for all of us freelance filmmakers. I'll leave a link in the description below for you to get 1 month free subscription with Epidemic Sound. Before I start, small disclaimer confirming that Panasonic did not sponsor this episode. Everything I mentioned here reflects my personal opinion. I happily paid the full price for this camera, so if those features make sense to you, then the S1H could potentially be a great camera for you as well. With that out of the way, let's dive in. The S1H can record 4K 60fps in 10-bit internal. Pretty amazing feature compared to all mirrorless cameras out there. But the frustrating catch was how this is restricted to 35mm mode, which has an almost 1.5x crop on this sensor. An unexpected drawback from a camera that's strongly advertised as a full-frame camera. Where switching to full-frame, your 4K or even 6K recording will max out at 30 frames per second. So is there a way to shoot high speed in full-frame? The answer is yes. The S1H is capable of shooting 120 frames per second 10-bit and 180 frames per second 8-bit with a slight crop in the frame, making it the only mirrorless camera that shoots at that speed and bit depth covering a full-frame sensor. The catch, as you might have guessed, is that you're restricted to Full HD resolution. But that shouldn't throw you off, since most of the media content we consume these days are displayed in small screens and are very often published in Full HD. To prove my point, here's a slow motion clip shot in Full HD, which blended pretty seamlessly with other 4K clips in this music video I shot recently with the S1H. Now check your streaming resolution and probably you'll realize that you're watching this video at Full HD, if not even at 720p, while I uploaded it in 4K. I hope I made my point. This feature of shooting 120fps in full-frame mode exists in the current full-frame mirrorless contender, the Sony a7 III and a7S II, which falls short against the S1H already, as it shoots at 8-bit, not 10-bit, and loses again since the S1H shoots up to 180fps, but in 8-bit this time. Let's bring in the BlackMagic 6K, the other contender on the 6K front. First of all, it has a Super 35 sensor, which is already cropped to almost 1.6x. And to shoot at 120fps, the BlackMagic will window the sensor further to a staggering 3.5x, which is a major drawback, as it will force you to change to a much wider lens if you want to match the field of view. For example, if you shoot with a 50mm, you'll have to swap it with a 40mm super wide lens to match the framing in high speed. To give you a bit of perspective on how that would look like, this is your 120fps on the S1H, and this is how much it will crop shooting on the BlackMagic 6K on the same 120fps. The only two advantages in the BlackMagic though are first, it shoots 120fps in 2.8K resolution and in 12-bit, as well as being able to shoot RAW internally on SD card versus compressed on both cameras. Yet soon we will hopefully have the ability of external RAW recording on the S1H once Atomos and Panasonic release the new firmware. There are rumors about the new Canon EOS R that could beat all of that, but it will be launched probably sometime mid-2020 and we're not even sure about the information, so we'll deal with that when the time comes. The S1H has a ridiculous amount of recording quality presets to choose from, 42 to be exact, so much that they have introduced the option to filter them in the recording format menu. But this overwhelming amount would be extremely unpractical to fiddle through on set. That's why my list feature is a perfect solution for it. It's a way to group all the preferred formats under one list, which you can later assign to a custom button for easy access while on set. I personalized my recording presets to include the highest resolution of 6K, followed by the highest 4K quality, then followed by the highest frame rate options of 120 and 180 FPS that we just talked about in the first point, which dramatically reduced my menu to only 7 presets. That's also very practical for me since my shoots are very diverse, from commercials to music videos to narrative and documentary, so every time I would do some minor adjustments in the list to include the ones relevant to my shoot. I haven't found that level of customization in any other mirrorless camera. Take the GH5 for example. They laid out all the presets in this grid that created a clutter and would distract you on set when you try to hunt for the right setting. Waveform monitor and vector scopes are pro-level cinematography tools used to measure both the brightness levels and the colors in your scene. They're one of the primary reasons why DPs use external monitors, as those features are rarely found in any camera, even in the professional cinema cameras. I personally find the waveform as an indispensable tool in all my shoots, especially when you're not shooting in RAW but in compressed formats that are not very forgiving when it comes to recovering highlights. Waveform helps me nail and confirm perfect exposure without relying too much on the camera's monitor, as it can be very deceiving. With all that said, having a waveform monitor in a mirrorless camera is mind-blowing. It helps in those days when I'm only relying on the camera's monitor and ensures perfect exposure metering. It's worth mentioning this was another great and unique feature in the GH5, a reason why this is one of my favorite compact video cameras. Waveform is surprisingly missing from the BlackMagic 4K and 6K, and not surprisingly missing from the A7 series since it's a more photocentric camera. You might argue that many cameras have histograms, which is more of a photography feature than video, and it does almost the same thing. To which I would respectfully disagree. I come from a photography background where histogram is the standard exposure tool, but discovering the waveform when I made the leap into film made me appreciate its awesome advantage over histogram, a subject that can be discussed in a separate episode. Before we check the S1H revolutionary screen design, let's have a look at the common designs out there. Most cameras in the market have some sort of articulation in their screens, yet each with its own set of limitations. The Sony A7 series only has a tilt option with a limited range of around 145 degrees between up and down. It's good enough for high and low angle shooting, but it doesn't allow any side viewing or selfie mode. The BlackMagic screen is completely fixed with a slight 9-degree tilt, an appreciated but not good enough attempt to be filmmaker friendly. The best option we had out there was in the GH5. Its screen flips out and tilts a full 270 degrees, which solved all problems other cameras suffered from, but created 2 other problems in the process. First, when the screen is closed, it's pretty much fixed. You have to flip it out in order to be able to tilt it up and down to make use of those 270 degrees, and flipping out would almost double the horizontal footprint of the camera, which would throw it off balance on a gimbal and forces you to rebalance the roll axis every time you flip out the screen. But the major drawback was how flipping it out would block the HDMI port. So if you try to connect it, you would drastically restrict the tilting of the screen, a design flaw that left us all scratching our heads. Somebody should have been fired for that back in Panasonic HQ. Now comes the S1H with a revolutionary and unique articulated screen design that combined best of both worlds. The screen can tilt up almost 80 degrees for those low angle shots similar to the Sony, then if you flip it out, then you get the full 270 degrees range of rotation similar to the GH5, which works perfectly for high angles as well as for selfie modes. And most of all, offers clearance from any obstruction to the HDMI port while enjoying a full range of tilt. I feel this could become the new standard in screen design, which seems to have inspired the new Fuji X-T4 based on those rumors. One of the first things I do when I buy or rent a camera is customize its menu and buttons to my shooting styles. Something I loved about the GH5 is the amount of customizable physical and virtual buttons it had. Additional to the ability to save the full layout of all your custom buttons preset in one file. A huge time saver when you want to transfer the settings to another camera or simply switch between settings for different types of shoots. Now the S1H took this customizability to another level. First, they offered you a very broad and deep level of customization to every single button, wheel and dial in the camera, with expanded amount of function possibilities for each. Second, they dedicated the top recording video button with a distinctive red color, then added one more button in the lower left side of the camera. Not to forget that the shutter release acts as a recording button as well. Having multiple recording buttons is a feature commonly found in pro-level cinema cameras. My Red camera also has 3 buttons, one on each side of the camera and one on the side grip. The reason is to have the record button more accessible from all sides, especially when you're rigging the camera in different ways that could prevent you from reaching the shutter button. Third, compared to the GH5, the S1H added 2 customizable buttons on either sides of the EVF and 1 extra button next to the lens. addition to the fact that the control wheel and joystick in the back are fully customizable with endless amount of assignable options. And third, if those physical buttons are not enough, you can still add virtual buttons on the touchscreen. And the beauty is you can disable them here to clear the display, something you couldn't do with the GH5. I honestly haven't seen that amount of customizability throughout my filmmaking career, starting from mirrorless cameras all the way through cinema cameras of all kinds. They all have different levels of customizability, but not to that level and depth. Short battery life is not a foreign concept in bigger cinema cameras such as the Red. They eat up a full average size V-Log battery in around 45 minutes, which is expected since those cameras have power-hungry processors with multiple fans to cool them down. But those big cameras usually exist in bigger productions, with bigger crews and camera assistants that would take away all your short battery life anxieties and let you focus on your shoot. That's why I chose smaller mirrorless cameras such as the GH5 for shooting my smaller productions, as it lives for up to 3 hours or more on a single battery cycle. So designing mirrorless cameras with a short battery life like cinema cameras that barely runs for 1 hour simply did not make much sense to me, such as the case with the A7S II and BlackMagic 4K and 6K, especially when BlackMagic cameras have internal fans and need high processing power for all those internal RAW recordings and high frame rates ProRes files. Simply a bad decision that I hope they fix in their next generation. So let's agree that the average of 2 hours is a reasonable amount to get you through a day of shoot with only 3 spare batteries. And the S1H delivered, despite its capability of internal 6K recording in very high data rates, and the fact that it even has an internal fan to cool down the huge processing power. Its battery life lasts for 2 hours or more, depending on your settings. I used it in more than 6 shoots already, and battery anxiety never kicked in like it did with the BlackMagic or the Red camera. So the S1H has proven to be a very power-efficient camera. One of the main advantages of cine lenses is their mechanical focusing system that has a linear focus transition, which sets them apart from photo lenses, meaning that focus in cine lenses changes in direct and linear relation to the rotation degrees of the focus ring, which is crucial for nailing perfect focus on the subject by marking its position on the follow focus knob and hitting it perfectly every single time you go back to it. Something we don't experience in modern photo lenses, since their focusing system is electronic, and it's electronically controlled by the focus ring's rotation speed instead, not its rotation degrees like in cine lenses, which is not linear but rather inconsistent and varies every time you change the focusing speed in a way that's hard to precisely predict. That system is called focus by wire or fly by wire. So the problem is how hard it becomes to nail perfect focus on the subject by marking its position on the focus ring, since it'll virtually never fall in the same spot, simply because every time you change your focusing speed, this focus position will change its place accordingly on the focus ring. This system works in favor of autofocus, but turns to be a pretty frustrating system in manual mode that's almost impossible to master. Thankfully, the S1H solved this issue by offering you an option to convert the lens focus by wire system in your photo lens into a virtual linear focus. It's like turning it into a cine lens, which I find not only revolutionary, but it's extremely economical if you once considered buying the cine version of the same lens, for the linear focus ability of course. Take for example the Sigma 50mm we have here. The cine version cost 3.5 times the amount of the photo lens, despite the fact that the optics used in both lenses are identical. The only difference is the bigger housing and electronic motors that were replaced with manual gears in the cine version, resulting in a bigger size and almost double the weight. Of course, I'm not saying this option will save you from buying cine lenses, since there's much more to cine lenses than just focus or weight, especially the ones that have no electronic photo version available. What I'm saying is how the S1H virtually upgrades all your existing photo lenses with a pro-level manual focusing system that could make your life a lot easier if you're a manual focus type of filmmaker, which is an essential skill you need to acquire as an indie filmmaker. The top status LCD is making its way back to some mirrorless cameras these days, namely the Nikon Z7 and the Canon EOS R for example. But those screens suddenly look very primitive miniatures compared to what the S1H just brought to the market. Set here side by side and to scale, you can see how the S1H screen is almost triple the size of the nearest competitor. It can host a lot more info, rendering it a lot more useful. So why do we need those screens? To me, they're very practical and useful references to have for a quick peek at the essential camera settings, especially when you prefer having a clean back screen without all the clutter displayed all around. Or in a similar setup, when you connect a monitor with a clean feed, this way your top LCD will be your reference for your settings info. So what makes it special? Apart from being the largest top LCD I found in any mirrorless camera of that caliber, it also lets you toggle between 2 info displays. The first is useful before you shoot for confirming the basic recording settings such as FPS, resolution, codec, iris, white balance and so on. The second is a status monitor, perfect for using after you start recording, as it displays what's more important during the shoot, such as the battery level, remaining recording time on your cards, time code, and most of all, audio meters. You can also customize their color from white to black and the reverse, or even backlight it during those shoots in dark sets or at night. Again, going this extra mile and beyond with their customizability. And finally, you can have it display the remaining record time on both cards and battery level even when the camera is off, so no need to boot up the camera anymore to check these infos. In-body image stabilization, aka IBIS, a feature that's common in smaller cameras such as the GH5 and the Sony A7, and just started gaining popularity now in higher-end cameras. The S1H broke the norm again from your typical IBIS settings usually found in other cameras, and hopefully will set a new standard with what I'm about to show you now, from body stabilization to lens stabilization to a combination of both. Then we have anamorphic lens stabilization with all different sorts of anamorphic ratios. We have horizontal stabilization, vertical, or auto if you're feeling lazy. Even electronic stabilization with a boost option that combines all the above to give you a rock-solid image, virtually turning your hands into a tripod. And most of all, you can register lenses that cannot communicate with the camera. So the camera would calculate the amount of stabilization based on the image projection circle of that lens, whether it's an anamorphic lens, which would use the full 3x2 sensor area, a full frame 16x9, or a Super 35 lens. I really respect the impressive amount of effort that went into this feature, honestly. Again, I wish other cameras would use this as a reference of how it's done. There's a feature called Image Area of Video. I have a full episode talking about how awesome it is. I highly advise you check it out. I'll leave the link in the description. But in brief, it's an option that enables you to have 3 different field of views while using the same lens by activating different areas of the sensor to capture the image, namely the full frame, the Super 35, and finally a pixel-to-pixel area, which is based on your final resolution output. It also enables you to use both full frame and APS-C or Super 35 lenses on this full frame camera. And finally, it oversamples the 6K sensor to record in 4K and Full HD resolutions, which improves the color accuracy, noise, and overall quality of the recordings. Again, if you want to know more details and how to take advantage of its full potential, then I invite you to check this episode, as there's a lot more to understand in it that can fit here. Since this camera is full of those little things that made my life easier on set, I realized that 10 features won't give it justice, so I added this lightning round of smaller yet honorable mentions. First, I just fell in love with this new lock lever on the left side. It lets you selectively disable the functionality of those camera controls as well as the touchscreen, preventing you from accidentally changing the camera settings while shooting if you hit any of them by mistake, a very common issue I personally suffered from in many of my shoots. I used to love this feature in my old Canon 5D Mark III, but it only locked the back wheel. It didn't have this awesome level of customization we have here in the S1H. Second, I was never a fan of the recording red dot. It's too small and discreet for me as an indication that the camera is recording on a screen cluttered with loads of info overlays, especially that it has an inconsistent placement that keeps on changing from one camera to the other. Now the S1H solved everything with this red frame indicator. Simple, obvious, and effective. Not to forget the 2 tally lights as well, in the back and the front of the camera. I really hope future cameras would adopt this approach. Third, this camera has a USB-C 3.1 that will not only transfer data in high speed from the card, but it can also quickly charge your battery in only 2 hours, virtually acting like a DC power and offering you uninterrupted operation time if you hook it to the wall or even to a portable battery pack. Perfect case for those lengthy interviews type of shoots. You might argue that the A7 III is capable of charging via USB as well, but the main 2 differences are, first, it's not fast charging, so eventually the charger won't keep up with the power consumption. Second, the A7 III doesn't have a fan like the S1H, so it heats up much quicker, which could potentially result in an increase in the amount of noise in the image, and eventually the camera could overheat and shut down. Finally, despite that this camera has a cooling fan in the back, Panasonic somehow found a way to make the S1H weather sealed. This is pretty substantial, as weatherproofing opens up a whole slew of shoot opportunities in challenging weather conditions that could prevent you from choosing other similar lever cameras such as the BlackMagic 6K or higher-end cameras such as the Canon C300, and of course cinema cameras such as Alexa or Red, which have their fans very exposed to the elements. Panasonic proved to be very keen on weatherproofing their cameras, as we can see. Its smaller GH5 sister was also weather sealed. They seem to understand how those smaller cameras are more likely to fit or be in more challenging weather conditions, and ensure to offer us peace of mind with such features. There's a lot more in this camera to fit in one episode, honestly, but this gives you some ideas to why the S1H is for the serious filmmakers. I'm not saying that this camera is all sunshine and rainbows. There will never be a perfect camera, but it seems that Panasonic were aiming in that direction with the S1H. As you know, I was only focusing on the smaller features you might have missed while reading about those flashier specs everyone is talking about. And as you saw, some of those small features are unique to the S1H, while others are found with less impressive twists in other cameras, but I personally haven't found one camera that has them all. Leave us a comment with your favorite feature, or maybe tell us about the ones that I missed that are worth mentioning. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.